I also came home every summer to work in my dad's store and also to work on what at this point was our small family farm. So that shows, I think, my rural roots, and the reason why I give a little biography of myself is so that you know that given my upbringing, I know the value of hard work, I know the importance of community, and I have a little bit of an idea of some of the issues facing rural communities. I then, of course, became a pointy-headed professor after graduate school. I'm a political scientist, but this is my first foray into politics, and I wanted to spend a minute telling you about my journey there. So at WSU Vancouver, one of the things I'm most proud of is something called the Initiative for Public Deliberation, where I train student facilitators to learn how to facilitate difficult conversations. And then we go into communities and we have those conversations in the community. We put people around a table, maybe 6 or 8 individuals. We make sure folks are from a diversity of backgrounds, both in terms of who they are and what they do. And the facilitator tries to guide the conversation to find common ground. We focus on shared values and beliefs. We focus on listening to understand. And we find out that if we use these techniques, we can have great conversations about issues like homelessness, affordable housing, even race. And it's because you've got somebody who really knows how to keep the conversation moving and how to avoid the polarization that so frequently happens in conversations about difficult issues. Does anybody live in a household where there's a Democrat and a Republican at the head, or you've got a variety in the, okay, only one of you?
Oh, you're kidding.
Wow. I have it in my own household. I'm married to a Republican. I have a daughter, Tennyson, who calls herself a Demopublican or a Republicrat, depending on who she likes at the time. So she's very smart and either is going to run a small country or she's a psychopath. I haven't decided which. But the reason why I mentioned the Initiative for Public Deliberation is because my approach to governing is to really look at those areas where we have common ground. I've been so disappointed about the increasing polarization in our political institutions and also in our civil discourse, which is no longer civil, it's actually uncivil discourse. And it has gotten particularly bad over the last year. It was also incredibly bad during the campaign for the 2016 election. We focused a lot on what was happening at the top of the ticket because it was so ugly, but it was actually happening throughout congressional campaigns, state legislative campaigns, and that got me so upset about the state of our democracy that when we had the election, I immediately started telling people that I wanted to pivot and look in another direction, and that direction is running for Congress and trying to fix this institution from within. So that brings me here. So although new, I think I have a great energy for this race because of all the good things I want to do. But I want to really make this about you and listening to your concerns. So I will tell you, this is the 5th town hall that we've had since launching our race 6 weeks ago. We have one more in Centralia in a week, and then we're going to start going through the counties again. I think town halls are incredibly important because I think they have to be arenas where we listen to one another, we listen to people in our community together, and we find out what their concerns are. And so my approach to town halls is to listen, to answer the questions that you have to ask me, and also my vow is to continue doing this. I think it's important to look people in the eye, especially when you disagree with them, so that I have an opportunity to explain my position, and then you also have an opportunity to tell me why I'm wrong. So that's why I'm doing it. That's why I'm doing it live, and it's unscripted and it's unscreened. So the way I'd like to do this evening is to just have you raise your hand, and I'll start calling on you. I'll use my professor background to find out who raises your hand first. I'm sure I'll screw up. I'm sure I thought I saw this. Okay. I'm sure I'll mess up, and if I do, just raise 2 hands. And I would ask that everybody try to get through one question so we can get as much input from as many people as possible. And then once we're through it, you can ask another question. I also really want to listen. I find town halls, even if it's about Q&A, is also that opportunity for me to hear about you and any concerns that we haven't talked about. So for the last 20 minutes or so, I'm just going to leave it open for you to have your, say your piece, talk to me about what's on your mind. Good or bad, because I do listen to what folks have to say because it is an important part of governing. It's also an important part of campaigns. So with that, and when you do ask a question, if you could introduce yourself so we know your name, that would be fantastic as well. So I think you were first.
Yeah, thank you. Jim Walker, I live in Vancouver, and my
question has to do with the 2010 Supreme Court decision of Citizens United. So how do you feel about that?
So, what was that decision? I've never heard of it. I think it's a terrible decision, but as I say on my website, it was not unexpected. So one of my fields is common law, so I saw it coming. I think it's incredibly unfortunate. The court was obviously deeply divided, so I think there is some movement on the court. Should there be new justices selected to maybe revisit it? But presently, I would like to see a constitutional amendment reversing that decision. That's the only way that we get around it, is to pass a constitutional amendment. We've done that 4 times in our history, but it's a very difficult thing to do. So I think in the meantime, we need to take measures to enhance our campaign finance reform laws. I think we need measures to make sure there's more transparency in campaign finance. I know that you all know, since you're all hardened, seasoned politicos here, that there's oftentimes that little blurb at the end of a TV ad, or a little box at the end of a print ad, which is in the tiniest possible print. I think that we should make those a lot bigger, louder, and bolder, so people know when they're seeing an ad, and a partisan ad, and they're often, if it's dark money, negative ads, so we know who does it, so that we can hold them to account. But it's a terrible decision. And I think you are next, actually. George?
Yes, George. The conversation about DACA has turned very, very political. And at some point, you have to, I believe there's a line between ethics and values and politics. And where would you draw that line, as a representative?
So first let me talk about DACA, and then the ethics and politics. Well, let me actually start with the first part, which is an easy question. Ethics is most important than politics. I think my motto, which is people over politics, shows where I feel about that. I don't think we should ever just hone the party line because of the D or the R after our name. So ethics are very important to me, and that's what would control how I approach governing. I think the issue of DACA is and how it's been handled is a travesty. The fact that it was being used as a political football over this continuing resolution that Congress was unable to pass is an embarrassment. And the reason why it is unfortunate that it's been used that way is there is wide bipartisan support on the Dreamers. And the fact that they have not acted since Trump undid Obama's executive order, I think, is a travesty. Instead, it seems like members of both parties are just holding it hostage, and therefore holding the lives of 700,000 Dreamers hostage. Which is, like I said, is a travesty. These are people who are at my university. They're in the armed forces, so they're serving their country, and they don't know what's going to happen. So I think that we need to address it, and the fact that you have an issue with bipartisan support that Congress is unable to touch shouldn't happen in a working democracy. And the fact that it is happening shows we are not a working democracy.
Yeah.
George had more for me, so if you don't raise your hand, we're going to go back. In the back.
Deborah Johnson.
Deborah. Ooh, that's a great question. The question was whether I would have voted for the continuing resolution this week. As it was presented, sort of that bill, or as just a standalone continuing resolution. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to figure out my answer. I'm stalling, Deborah.
I'm not sure it was my son's question, but I thought before they had it, they added the CHIP provision for 6 years. Yeah, it was CHIP for 6 years, and then DACA was attached to it in exchange for possible funding for the wall. And then my understanding is that Trump withdrew his support. But the question is, would I have voted for the CR? Yeah, because I thought the CR was just to get us through to...
oh, yeah, it's a month. It's a month, yeah.
But it did include 6 years.
It did, and it included a compromise for DACA. I probably would have voted for it because I think both of those pieces of legislation are tremendously important. How I want to answer it, because I care about process, is we need to get rid of continuing resolutions. It is unfortunate that this is how we fund our government. I think it was the 13th time. They need to have a comprehensive bill through appropriations. This is absolutely ridiculous. We wouldn't do that in our own household, would we? Do any of you do that? You probably don't. So we expect more from our members of Congress. And I think that it's terrible strategy, and it seems like there's strategy on both sides on who wins and who loses, and that's not what politics is about. It's about passing legislation, serving the needs of the American people. So one of my hopes is that people will say to Congress, this is enough. I don't care about how you get there, but sit down, work out some compromises, don't wait till the 11th hour, and don't put the lives of people in jeopardy and use them as political footballs. That's a great question. Tell your son he did well. Yeah, that's a good question. That's good. Good. Richard. Jim.
I'm Jim Keefetala.
Jeff.
How do you feel about, is it possible for Congress to pass some rules where they have single focus legislation and bills instead of having 10 things attached to it so they can bat their heads together?
That's a great question. So my team gets horrified, but as a political scientist, I love talking about the difference between an omnibus bill and these single pieces of legislation. So yeah, it can be done. It's actually done quite often where there is just a single bill. But instead, Congress strategically puts them together in order to achieve political gain. The way I'll answer this is one of the things that I would love if I'm elected, and I'm honored to serve you in Congress, is to be on the Rules Committee. And it sounds really boring, but the Rules Committee is a traffic cop to Congress. And so the Rules Committee often sets it sets the terms of the debate, how bills will go through the process. And the reason why I like it is because I think we can force members of Congress to approach governing differently. Now it's done incredibly politically, and it's one of the reasons you see the results that we see now. I also think as Americans, as Washingtonians, we need to demand that of our members of Congress. We oftentimes, and I'm sure many of you in this room, have contacted your member saying how unhappy you are about something he or she did. I would also ask for you to say, I don't like what you did, and this is what I'd like you to do differently. Not just vote on a particular bill, but focus on the process and say, quit doing that. Quit having 13 continuing resolutions to fund our governance. Focus on the process, not just your difference in political opinion. And I think that'll make a difference. In the back. And I'm sorry, your name, please?
My name is Alice.
Alice.
My question has to do with climate. 2016 was the hottest year on record. 2017 was second. I would like you to discuss your thoughts and your opinions on the role of the United States in trying to lower the climate change.
Okay, so the question was about climate change and the United States' role. Let me begin by saying climate change is real. I stand with the vast majority of scientists who see that this is real and it's happening, and I think it can't be ignored. We've been ignoring it for too long. Let me also say that I think pulling out of the Paris Accord was a real problem for the United States because we lost that leadership role in dealing with climate change. And you want to be in that leadership role because if the U.S. isn't there, some other country is going to be there. And so I think that was really regrettable, and I don't know about you, but I haven't heard the replacement that we were promised from the White House. I believe globally that we need to have a reduction in our reliance on fossil fuels. I think it's something that doesn't happen overnight, but there are measures that we could have put in place in order to get there. Washington State is a leader in clean energy, and not only is that good for the climate, it's good for jobs. And a number of jobs have been created through a lot of what Governor Inslee has done. So I'd like to see some of Inslee's work at the state level happen at the federal level, because you can't change climate state by state. It's just not possible. I think we should still pursue it to show that this is something that can be done, that it's feasible, and we can, what is it? There's a term in business, ratchet it up? What is it? Scale it up. But there's a way we can scale this thing up. So that's why I'm encouraged by what Washington has done. But we need to do it in Congress. We need to accept the fact that it's real and that we're almost at a tipping point from what I've been hearing about where it maybe going too far and it may be too little too late. Yeah, I think I saw something the other day that said 2020, but it varies a little. But it's something that we should all be concerned about. I have a small child, the leader of a future small country or large country, and I worry about her because she's the one who's going to be paying the price for climate change. Many of us are already paying the price through increased forest fires, through flooding issues in certain parts of the community. I think the problem is that we don't know how to talk about it. Most people will say, I'm for or against climate change, and I think the way to talk about it is to say, let's talk about forest fires. Let's talk about flooding. And that's the way that you can talk about the policy problem without trying to get into our little posts where we disagree on whether or not it's real. Thanks, Allison. Good question. This is a smart group. Yes.
My name is Wendy Schul. I have a lot of concerns, but I'll just stick to two. One is the integrity of the election process in some of our states. I'm really concerned about that, including barriers for some people to vote. I think that really needs to be worked on. I want to know how you felt about that. And another thing that I really am for term limits, because I think some of these people are in Congress too long. And it just becomes a little too complicated for them. And for Citizens United, get rid of it.
You guys should start leading the Washington group to overturn it. Let me start with the integrity of the elections process, because I too am concerned. And first, let me say that it's my understanding that there are several bills in the Washington legislature that will expand suffrage, even things like same-day registration, which I think is enormously important. There's so much focus by some individuals on non-existent voter fraud. Let's focus on increasing the franchise. Let's focus on getting people to the ballot box, making it easier for them to vote. So on the state level, although I don't play a role, I'm really encouraged to see those efforts. Because I think that it's such an important part of who we are as a democracy. And you want to get kids out of high school voting early because it becomes a habit, because it's fun. They have some agency and some role in the process. So I think that's exciting at the state level. I am horrified that not more has been done at the federal level to address the issue of the 2016 election. It is insane to me that it's a year out and we know that things are going on, but some people don't know that things are going on, or they don't. They're turning a blind eye to it. I think we're absolutely naive if we think that it isn't going to happen again, because it's inevitable that it will. And the federal government can help states by providing them funds so that they can look at their process, instead of, again, focusing on non-existent voter fraud. Or there are a couple cases, but there are not many. There's been work on this. So the second part of your question was about term limits. So historically, I always thought term limits were a terrible idea, because then those staffers would be in charge of governing. And many of them, no disrespect to staffers, some of who hope to continue with me to DC, but that worried me because they're not accountable to the people. Many of them are experts. Some of them are doing it for the first time. That's always been a concern of mine. I'm rethinking that. And it's not because I think it's necessarily the best idea, but I think we could maybe start with, you can only serve 10 terms in Congress. You know, when you're there for that long, that's of concern to me. But I don't have a hard and fast response, because I also appreciate the expertise members of Congress gather, having been there for a long time. Yeah, that's a tough one. And I'm sort of rethinking my position. But right now, I don't have anything firm. But I hear frustration in your voice. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, maybe if we got the money out of politics, but some of these people, I don't even know what they're doing. They're beyond even coherency. It's just discouraging. And I have 6 grandchildren, and I want a better life than them. That's why I want to complain. I want to do something about it.
Absolutely. And I think today, how many people marched today? Good for you. Or 1-year anniversary of the Women's March. You know, I think that one of the things that will come out of these real turbulent times that we have, in terms of how we talk about politics, is that there's sort of renewed activism. People are entering politics for the first time. Why? Donald J. Trump. Okay? Women are getting involved for the very first time for the same reason, or because of the other things that they're seeing. And so I think that we need to take that energy and capitalize on it. So that's a silver lining. But I think I share your concerns, and I think there are many people who feel the same way, but aren't going to town halls. They feel the same way, but they aren't voting. They feel the same way, and they aren't volunteering. And that is tragic. And so I don't know, I don't care who you work for, I don't care how you get there. I think we have an obligation to participate in our democracy. And everybody talks about how great the United States democracy is. It is, it's fabulous, but it could be so much better. And so just because people criticize it doesn't mean we don't think it's great, but it certainly can be improved. Okay, I didn't know who was first, okay.
Carolyn, how do you feel about NAFTA and the Trans-Pacific trade agreements that seem to be disappearing?
Yeah, so Washington, as you know, is the most trade-dependent state in the union. We're heavily reliant with our jobs on trade. I think you should look at every trade deal separately. I know the TPP had a lot of criticism. I shared some of those criticisms about it. I don't think we should shut the door on a future type of arrangement with multiple countries because I think it will benefit Washington and other states in the U.S. And I think NAFTA has its good things and its bad things. We have global economies and we have the movement of goods across country lines. I think what we have to make sure when we have trade deals is to make sure it doesn't have an unintended impact on labor because I think that's tragic for our workforce. And I talk a lot about bringing jobs to the region, and we certainly don't want to ship our jobs overseas. So my answer would be we have to look at each trade deal independently and to really try to anticipate, based on past trade deals, what is or is not successful and what some of those unintended consequences might be.
Richard Lee, Ridgefield. In our nation, disease, disorder, and illness have been allowed to become a business model. Last year, 630,000 of our citizens had to declare bankruptcy due to medical expenses. In the civilized, industrialized nations, that number was 0. What would you do, or what would you consider to stop this horrible situation, or what form of national health insurance could you support?
So I'll tell you what I aspire to, and then in the long run, and then I'll tell you what I want in the short run, because I look at this as a policy question, and I look at what can be done. So I think that as a country, we should aspire to some system which provides universal care. I think that that's inevitable. I think it's going to occur. And some of the most robust energy behind that are people who are younger, who actually are suffering from not having access to care, or that access being very expensive. So I think we're eventually going to get there. I think it's going to take some time, and I think there's some things we need to do in the interim. So I think we should immediately fix the ACA. It was an imperfect way of looking at healthcare, to use a marketplace model. It did, however, lead to a number of people being insured for the first time, so it saved lives. It hopefully saved people in the pocketbook. Stopped the number of people going to the ER, because now they had preventative care that was available to them. But it's being undermined by the administration in terms of people not being able to sign up for it. It's being undermined in terms of what the Trump administration just did in terms of the individual mandate, which is going to encourage freeloaders, and people aren't going to sign up for care. And I think it's an intentional attempt to make the ACA unworkable. And I think that that is a travesty, which is my word for today. Travesty. Travesty. So that is unfortunate. But I think that we can fix parts of the ACA right now. I think the Murray-Alexander bill, which is being deliberated in Congress when they want to talk to each other, is one way of shoring up the markets for some of these insurers who are moving away. And in fact, my understanding in speaking with Senator Murray's staff is that they were making great progress on that bill to help patch up the ACA before Trump decided this issue about the individual mandate. So I think that's unfortunate, but we can do it if Congress can work together, which I think it could. I think at some point we need to start talking about a public option so that there is some sort of government-funded insurance for individuals. And so I think that's one of many proposals that I'd like to take a look at in order to see whether or not it can help provide the care and also to avoid what you're talking about in terms of bankruptcies. And this is it's a big issue for me. 2 members of my family, a brother and a sister, don't have care. One because she's having troubles, and then the other because he simply can't afford it. And so I think every single one of us in this room, and I would challenge you if you disagree with me, every single one of us in this room has been touched by not having access to health care. It's a major part of our economy, and so we need to look at this as like the most important, aside from climate change, actually, the public policy issue that we face today. And to call out politicians who use it as a partisan football, call out politicians who vote to repeal the Affordable Care Act dozens of times only to please constituents because it doesn't do anything, and ask them to fix the problem because they have to, so we avoid these situations. So I need to know who was next. Okay, I don't know, but I'm going to go here because I could see you and I wasn't sure. Yes, you're next.
Hi, Greg Franklin. I'm precinct committee chairman for in the 17th, and I financially supported Bernie because I thought he mostly took individual contributions rather than corporate money, and I know Jamie takes a lot of corporate money. What's your standing on contributions? If I'm going to support you financially, I want to know what else is going to go into your pot.
Sure. So you know this is going to be an expensive race, and you know it's going to be a difficult race. My fundraising strategy is as many individual donors as possible, because I think that is a sign of broad support. That's what Senator Sanders had. I think it's a lot easier to just rely on individual donors in small amounts if you're running a national race than a state race. So I will accept money from PACs that align with my values and beliefs. I'm not going to change who I am or how I feel about a policy position just to get money. I wouldn't be able to keep track of that. I'm going to be who I am. I'm going to support the causes I support. And if they want to provide me a financial donation, I would take it. So to give you an example, I filled out the questionnaire for Planned Parenthood. It was the fastest questionnaire I've ever filled out because I agree with a lot of, if not, I think it was everything that they asked me about. If they were to offer a donation to my campaign, I see it as a donation of an organization that reflects its constituents' concerns. And because it reflects its constituents' concerns, I see it as an indirect way of getting money from individuals. I don't, of course, have any power over super PACs because you can't coordinate with them, but I would hope that super PACs did not spend money on my behalf, because most of what they do are hit pieces, pieces that aren't encouraged to have a conversation, but rather to point out somebody's flaws. And if a super PAC runs an ad that is done in a way that's uncivil or distasteful, I'll call them out on it, because I think it's bad for our democracy. So that would be my approach. And I hope to earn your support and your check. No matter the size.
My name is Eric Jonas. I want to build on your comment about the single payer and healthcare issue. It seems to me that healthcare providers are becoming huge, and there's been lots of mergers, and to have something like single payer with these gigantic organizations, corporate companies, it seems like they have to maybe be broken up, like we were talking about breaking up banks 10 years ago. Just an idea.
Yeah, I've not thought about that. I think that's interesting. I really do. It's a tough issue. It's a complicated issue. But certainly you are seeing these mega mergers, and I'm sure that there's been some policy work done on the impact that that has on care, including the delivery and cost, and I'll definitely start looking into it. And maybe sponsor legislation that addresses that. Okay. Now I get scared. I'll go in the back, there, and there. Okay? Yes?
Speaking of medical issues, what about the large pharmacy companies that not only take over something and then you efficiently give it such a great cost, but also will change the medication just slightly that you have to get that medication at a higher cost without going with your generic?
Yeah. So, and it's even worse than that because they go by there are formularies. I'm sure this is not a surprise to many of you, which drugs are covered by which plans, and those formularies change all the time. So there's a lot of shenanigans going on, which is what I think is implicit in your question. And also, one thing I would add is we're seeing the cost of generics go up as well. When they first started coming out, they were a lot more affordable, but now there's not a whole lot of difference, at least over the counter, and you're seeing less and less difference at the pharmacy for prescriptions. So we must do something about prescription drug costs, particularly because it affects seniors and our people who are most vulnerable because of their health problems so dramatically. So I think that there's a way in which we can skin this cat. I think we have to work a little bit with the pharmaceutical companies to do this because they're going to scream about how they need that money for research and development. And of course, we want to encourage research and development. But there also has to be a way that we can not have them manipulate the way in which drugs are delivered to patients in terms of cost so that people are impacted negatively. So that's a big issue. I think a lot about it. Again, going back to healthcare, I've got family members who spend hundreds of dollars on drugs every month, and not everybody can afford that. And there are people who are choosing between feeding themselves and their family and their prescription drug, and that's a Hobson choice. It's a terrible choice. So I think increasing our attention on this issue nationally, because you haven't heard much over the last couple of years about it, is something that we can do and something I certainly would fight for. So I think it was this gentleman and then here. Yeah, in the blue, yeah.
My name's Phil Simon, I live in Vancouver, and my question is about PAYGO, and if we can get rid of it. And preface to that is I couldn't see or hear the name, but the committee chairman who mentioned Bernie Sanders. As part of this PAYGO question, his chief economist is a woman named Stephanie Kelton, who's the chair of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. I hope you take a chance to get to know her, and her economics. I'd be happy to help hook you up with her if you don't have any inroads into that. But can we get rid of PAYGO and balanced budget amendments and stuff like that? Would you oppose those things so that we can get back to making the federal government's budget counter-cyclical?
Yeah, so PAYGO is that if you are offering something, you have to offset there's so many acronyms in my mind these days. So PAYGO is if you increase spending somewhere, you've got to decrease it somewhere else. Is that right? I think that's a terrible idea. I think it's overly rigid, actually. I think the principle behind it is a good one, which is you want to control spending so you don't have costs skyrocket. But I think those sort of rigid approaches, and those are all internally done, sort of restrict lawmakers. And so I'd have to look at it a little bit more to give you a more sophisticated answer. I know that for balanced budget amendment, I've never been in favor of it as a political scientist because, again, I think it restricts the way that you can engage in budgeting. But it's a mess already because of these continuing resolutions. So we've got to do something. I welcome your recommendation of Stephanie. I'll look into her work and have a better answer next time I see you. Keith? Ken?
No.
Kelly.
Battleground. I'm an independent, and I'm financially conservative and socially liberal. The question I would have is, on the financial conservative side, what could you do, or what programs would you be willing to look at, subsidies that would be cleaned up or discontinued? It feels like every program that's ever funded becomes a permanent expense, complete financial responsibility at the federal level. It's such a bloated. What would you do to shrink the bloated bureaucracy? Things like tobacco subsidies is one that just tweaks my.
Yeah. Well, and also
we're killing people with tobacco, but we're going to subsidize it, and my taxes are going to pay for that.
Yeah. So subsidies are an easy one, right? Because what we do is we talk to the lawmakers who are benefiting from the subsidies, that are encouraging the subsidies because they're benefiting from those industries or those businesses. So a tobacco farmer is going to give somebody money if they're in favor of subsidizing their crops. I think we need to call them out for that. So I think a little bit more transparency would be useful. I think there is some low-hanging fruit, and that's one of them. I think it gets a little bit more difficult after that because I think there are many tales about bloated bureaucracy, and I'm sure that they're there. But I think we need to have a little bit more of a systematic way of looking at it. Because in my history of observing politics, I always hear the tales, the anecdotes about somebody who is buying lobster with food stamps, or somebody who is taking advantage of medical care to, get more x-rays. We hear these anecdotes about how people are exploiting the system. So I have taught hundreds of students in your community. I've hopefully taught your children or your friends, and ask them that question. And they will tell you the answer, which is that I am tough, but I am fair. And I'm tough because I hold people and myself to the same standards, but I'm fair in that I listen to all sides. So I hope that you don't have the impression that I'm not a tough person. And so you can talk to Tyler or Ian or others, or, oh my gosh, it's so good to see you. It's like I see it, you're everywhere. I'd like a campaign donation. Ask them, but I have to tell you, we have to start from there, because if we continue electing people to office who only look at party identification, who only do what the party leaders say they should do, we will not get anything done. We won't. We will just continue the trend that we've gone down the last couple of years. And so I do think that you have to appreciate the approach, because it shows a promise for the future. If we continue to elect people in gerrymandered districts who are only hugging the far left or far right, you're not going to get any governing done. And I think that's a problem. But I am a hard worker, but I am also a scrapper. And if I disagree with somebody, it'll be civilly, but I can also civilly draw a contrast with someone. What I don't like are ad hominem attacks, tweeting, because it doesn't allow us to have a substantive conversation. And I think there are many people in Congress who want to have that substantive conversation. And more importantly, I think there are many Americans, and there are a whole lot of Washingtonians who want us to have that substantive conversation. In the back. No, sorry. You already asked a question. And you had 2 questions before. And you're jumping the queue, and now that I've called on you, I can't take it back.
In 2020, the census will be taken. So I really believe both parties, or 3 parties, whatever they are, I think it should be done outside of any kind of party. I think it should be like my husband is such a stuff. Mathematical algorithm that just comes to come up with, and that's how they redistrict. So that's my unanswered. I answered my own question.
Yeah. Well, let me actually add on to it. Many states do it by committee, and I think that's exactly the way to do it. California does it by committee. It is something, of course, that the state decides. So let me give a shout out to my friend Kathy Gillespie. Where's Kathy? I'm sorry, I can't see you. I think the way to get this done is to elect people like Kathy so she can bring that message to Olympia so that we can address this problem at the state level. And I think we've really seen it done successfully in many states because when it's done for partisan reasons, it's a problem. I have a little bit of hope because the Supreme Court has 2 partisan gerrymandering cases that they're looking at. And I have to say, there is no way these are going to withstand constitutional scrutiny, but I'm constantly surprised by this court. So we'll have to see what happens. But it can happen at the state level, and you've got a champion right here. Okay, somebody who hasn't asked a question. Okay, I'm sorry. John, you were so kind. I called on you. I saw you, and you were in the queue, and then I forgot about you.
That's all right.
Okay.
What are your ideas on how to control our military-industrial complex?
So first is increased transparency. It's interesting that we don't hear so much about it now. I think this budget crisis that we were sort of talking about earlier is an opportunity to look at military spending in a comprehensive way. I think we have to hold members of Congress to account. There are many members who actually benefit from the industries that they bring to their district. It's why I think public shaming sometimes is a good thing to do. Because it isn't necessarily quid pro quo, but it sure feels that way to a lot of us. I also think we have to make sure that what we're investing in terms of military spending is something that can protect the troops and not go into the pockets of people who are manufacturing things like tanks, which we don't use. But I'm going to start with transparency because it's not an issue we're talking a whole lot about. But I think that that's one way that we can sort of expose what might be some of the problems in how we're spending these monies. It certainly isn't just more nukes, which I heard from this current administration, or just, spending a whole lot more. That doesn't seem like a very sophisticated way of dealing with this particular issue. But I really think putting the troops' safety paramount is how we start that conversation, look at how the funding is taking place, and then really, again, holding people to account for where how they're voting in terms of how they might individually benefit in their district. Okay, so now, so I said Candy. I'm going to go back to George. I probably said somebody over here. Okay, so Candy. But you, George, did you ask one already?
I asked one.
Okay, so wait, you just hold on. I'm not going to let you, like a gal in the back. Okay, Candy.
So I was going to ask about your thoughts on Social Security. Because I'm at the tail end of the baby boomers and struggling with the fact that as you get up there, and you get thrown back into the job market by corporations who are cutting people who've been in there for a while because they're getting rid of the old, bringing in the new, and you can't blame them for that. That's a lot of innovation and good thought there. But it puts us in a bad place where we're struggling to get those same kind of good jobs we had. And then Social Security, there's always this conversation, what's going to happen with that in the future. So just kind of feeling out your opinions.
So let me tackle the Social Security part. I think that it is our most important program that we all pay into and all have a right to get money from. It is unfortunate whenever we have a budget crisis that we start talking about playing with Social Security. And oftentimes the way people want to play with it is increasing the age in which somebody is eligible for Social Security. So let's say you're right on the cusp and all of a sudden they pass legislation. You might be, oftentimes they grandfather people to a certain extent, but I think that's really unfortunate because people start to plan their retirement with a certain idea in mind, and when we open up that conversation, you're sort of ripping out the rug from under them. So I think we need to protect it as much as possible. Understand that one of the reasons why we protect it is there are a lot of seniors who rely on it exclusively for their income. People like my mother-in-law who relies on it exclusively, and it's not a whole lot of money. So whenever somebody talks about fiddling with it, I think about my family, and I think about what they paid in, and how devastated they would be economically if we messed with it. But make no mistake about it, this is something that a conservative Congress will look at, because they always do. So I think we need to be galvanized in terms of holding up against the breach, and also personalize it. So everybody knows that when we're talking about cutting Social Security, we're talking about taking away those benefits from parents, from grandparents, from aunts and uncles. And so I think that will help it resonate with people a little bit more. And I think it's a travesty that there are seniors who are having to go back into the workforce because they don't have enough money to pay the bills. Because then they're competing against people who are entering the workforce. So both groups of individuals are at a disadvantage in that sort of scheme. So you shouldn't have it happening. Okay, so I said Candy, and then did I go over here? I don't know who's in control of this. Why? Okay, right here. Blame the tall guy then, not me, okay?
So foreign aid, it's less than 1% of the budget, and it's been on the chopping block and in relationship to the military-industrial complex and taking care of our troops. What do you know about foreign aid and how do you feel about it?
So all the pop quizzes I've given throughout my history come back and haunt me whenever I have a town hall. So big question. Let me tell you what I do know and why I think it's important. It is such a tiny part of our budget, as is funding for things like the United Nations. So what I see happening with foreign aid is it's being used as a little political, I don't know what the term, I'm not coming up with a clever term, but it's being used, what was it?
Bribe.
A bribe? Oh.
A red herring.
A red herring. Oh, who said red herring?
Red herring.
Former student of mine.
Yes.
Kirsten. And I gave her that term, I'm sure, 10 years ago when she was in my class.
More like 20 years ago.
20, oh yeah. We're both getting old.
Yeah, I know.
So I think it's used as a red herring, and I just love that. And it's used in a way to have people have a misunderstanding about foreign aid. So I think we need to stop doing that, which is why I love that you started your question with, it's like less than 1%. I think aid is important because there are countries that are struggling, and that tiny bit of aid that we provide saves lives. So if we are a loving country, as I think we are, if we care about life, which I think we do, foreign aid is an integral part of making sure that people get vaccinations, that people get food, and people get the health that they need. So I think that's how we have to talk about foreign aid, rather than using it as a red herring. Trademark Kirsten. Okay, where do I go next? Are you sure? He asked a question already. You're terrible at this. Tyler's mom.
My name is Christy Billings, and I'm from Vancouver. And a couple key things you just said about caring about people's lives and, health care. A big concern for me is this new law, or this expanded law, I don't know what actually to call it, that Trump has been talking about, the religious freedom law. It infuriates me as a female and as a parent.
Yeah, so the question was about the Religious Freedom Law. I don't know the specifics. I'll tell you, I wrote a book about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and a court decision, so I'm going to try not to get too wonky on you. So instead, I'm going to look at the general theme that I think is in your question. So what we see happening at a lot of states are religious freedom laws. They're little religious freedom or religious liberty laws. And they're passed in order to grant more protection for people of faith, which I think is not necessarily a bad idea if people of faith are being targeted in a way that they're not able to practice their faith. However, what's happening with these laws, and Indiana is a good example, is they are also being used to protect discrimination against certain groups of people. So we saw what happened when Vice President Pence, now then Governor Pence did. We saw what happened with Pence when he signed a state law protecting religious liberty in his own state, which is a lot of businesses sort of they pressured him to change his mind. He didn't change it enough, in my opinion, to protect vulnerable populations like the LGBTQ community. But it showed that when you use laws to protect faith, to discriminate against people, the people aren't going to stand for it. Because we've seen discrimination. We see it still. And so I think that's one of the things that we're waking up to in terms of how those laws have a disproportionate impact on people. I haven't heard Trump talk about a federal religious freedom law yet. He should probably stop talking about it because it's unconstitutional, and he should buy my book. I'll take the 65 cents I earn from it, and I'll contribute it to the Democratic Party, and we all win. Okay, so you've asked, you haven't. So I'm going to go to the back. I'm going to take care of this side of the room, then I'm going to come back to that side of the room. Okay, yes?
What's your education policy?
So my education policy...
Particularly as it relates to elementary, high school, junior high, and the problems that they face.
So K-12 education, I'm going to leave to my friends like Kathy Gillespie, because it is very much a state issue. I think where the federal government can help is to provide funding for individuals, individual school districts, particularly ones that don't have adequate funding for children with special needs, adequate funding for communities where you don't have a good K through, pre-K program. So I think for K through 12 or pre-K through 12, I think enhancing the amount of federal fundings that we have, particularly as they help disadvantaged groups, would be my priority. In terms of higher education, which you didn't ask, but I'm going to answer, I think making sure that we have funds available through not just student loans, which are horrible, as I said, I'm still paying mine, but through free money in terms of Pell Grants has got to be a top priority. And I would also say in terms of education, I'm not just speaking obviously about colleges and universities, but about community colleges. I think the federal government can do more in providing funding so that we can have technical training for individuals who don't want to go to university. Yeah. Well, I was trying to understand where you were asking, so yeah, ask again.
So what you see is the problems with the schools face, because obviously you're in the universities, and you're seeing the students that are coming in. Where are their weaknesses? Where are the problems that they're facing that aren't being addressed?
The weaknesses of the students coming in. So for me, the weaknesses of the students coming into Washington State University, Vancouver, is that there aren't more of them coming to WC Vancouver because they can't afford it. The weakness is the fact that if I look at my classroom of 30 on any given term, I would say that 3/4 of them have family, they have 1 or 2 jobs, and they're paying for school. That's a problem. I would say that they are fairly well prepared for the university, but that's because oftentimes they come from a segment of the population where they have benefited from having good schools. I think you have to look at education as a pipeline, which I think is implicit in your question, which means the better prepared they are, K through 12, the better prepared they'll be at the university. I would ask them what they want to do, because I don't come from a position, even though I'm in a university, that every person goes to college. If you look at people in my own family, 2 of my brothers didn't go to college. One went for a little while, the other one didn't go at all. He's a professional gambler, makes more money than anybody. So I think that there are other pathways for people once they leave high school. So I think we have to start in the high schools to make sure that we have training for them through apprenticeships and internships. I'd like them to be training that are attached to unions where there are skilled jobs, because I think for those who don't wish to go to university, and there are many who do not, we need to show them paths for well-paying jobs. And we have to do that by working in concert with the schools and also working with organizations. So that's what I would do. And I think it's important to recognize this. And I think there are probably people in this room who haven't gone to university who have done well. So let's find out what we can do to support those who don't want to go. If you do want to go, let's make sure they have the funding that makes it possible for them to go. And let's encourage them. So more work with the high schools. We can talk a little more later. If you're still not satisfied, I can see in your eyes. So we'll chat more about it. George.
2 quick comments and a question. One, thank you. Thank you very much for doing this. Secondly, a potential really easy cure for funding Social Security is just to lift the cap for both corporations and individuals, and the problem goes away.
Yeah, I agree, actually. So the cap was raised recently, but not raised nearly enough. Obviously, that would create a lot of revenue and it would stabilize the system. That's certainly a policy solution I'd like to explore because I think it's a good one. And it doesn't make any sense that there's a cap either. Lily, you're a student of mine and I've ignored you, so I'm sorry.
My name is Liliana. I am 23 years old and I attend WSCB. I'm first generation college student, and out of all my concerns, my concern right now is housing. My husband and I are newlyweds. We got married in March, and we made a little over $51,000. And him and I, we pay 38% of our income is for housing. We paid $1,400 for a 2-bedroom apartment behind the mall. And I feel like we can work right now. We're healthy enough to work 2 jobs each, but for people who can't, what can we do for them? Or is there anything that we can do right now with the housing situation? Because I see myself never having a home, and I'm 23, and it feels like it will be out of my reach.
So when I mentioned your typical WCB student, Lily is one of them, working a couple jobs, can't afford a home, 2 jobs, as is her spouse. So this is really a problem. And then the problem of housing is one that extends throughout the nation in many communities. You're obviously feeling it in Vancouver. I know it's an issue also in Battleground. It's also an issue in the rural areas. I was encouraged that the city of Vancouver passed the voters of the city of Vancouver passed a measure to provide more funding for affordable housing units. I'd like to see more of that happen because it's usually happening at the local level rather than at the federal level. There are 2 federal agencies that deal with housing in terms of providing support for the states so that they can encourage them to come up with ways to make it a dream for people. So obviously we want to see how those are working and how they can be expanded so they can address this issue. Because it is unfortunate not only that you're paying such a high rate, but you're also not then investing in a home, which you can have for so long. So I think we have to approach it as a way to provide stability, particularly for young people like you. I think you said you're 23. I should have remembered that. Because if you were to start buying a home now, because it was available and affordable, in 20 years and 30 years, you would have a great deal of equity that you could pass on to your children or use it in order to prepare for your retirement. So I think that there are things that we can do at the federal level. There's also things that we can do at the local level, which is why I use the Vancouver example, and certainly things that we can do at the state level to bring down the costs, or at least to provide opportunities where people can borrow so they can get into a house. Okay, now I said, I'm going to go to this gentleman in the back because he's been patient. You're next over there. Okay.
Steve Foster, Santa Cruz. Over the years, I've always had a particular interest in stories about young, energetic, smart, well-qualified people going into political office at the federal level. And the stories that follow a year or 2 later always seem to be that they get swallowed. They just get, all these ambitions, all these dreams get swallowed up by the system and the politics and the rules. And I'm sure that if you thought about running for this office, you said to yourself, I will let that happen to me, I will work within the system, or I won't let that happen to me. I just wonder what your apprehension is, or do you have a value system that you're going to walk into that mess with?
That's a great question. So I am the 4th Democrat to enter this race, even though I was thinking about doing so a little over a year ago today. The reason why I took my time to make the decision is I'm a very intentional person, I'm a very pragmatic person. And I wanted to make sure that I dotted all the I's and crossed the T's in terms of why I'm running and why it's a good idea for both me and for Southwest Washington. So I've thought a lot about this, and I've thought a lot about how Washington as an institution can change someone. But then I thought about who I am as a person. And I've always seen myself as a problem solver. I've always seen myself as somebody who doesn't sit by the sidelines while our democracy falls apart. I see myself as a doer, and I would bring that attitude to Washington. And I would hope that it works. And if it doesn't, and I am swallowed up by the system, then I could see myself heading in a different direction. Because I thought that what we've done at the university through the Initiative for Public Deliberation showed we made a real difference in our democracy. I would say, I'm going to try to find another way, another outlet for my energy. But I can't not try. And just like none of you can't not try to get involved, because times are too rough right now. And I think if we sit by the sidelines, that it's just going to continue to get worse. The loudest, the angriest voices are going to dominate the discourse, and then people are going to exploit the divisions for personal gain. And I can't watch that happen. So I want to be part of the solution, not that I would be part of the problem if I didn't run, but that's the approach that I'm going to bring to Washington. And let me tell you something else about me, although it's usually said negatively. I'm a really impatient person. I didn't start with a city council race. I didn't start with some minor office, although maybe I should have. I'm 51. I don't have that much time left. So I'm going to get there, and I'm going to work hard, and I'm going to work fast. Because I think that's the sort of energy you need in order to effectuate change in what is a broken institution. And I tell you, I really believe this as a political scientist and not as a candidate. I think the time is coming. I really think it's coming. And that what we've lived through over the last couple of years, if not this year, has prepared us for this moment. And it's not just about encouraging people to run for office, it's about getting people involved. Having Lily, who's 23, come here to a town hall to find out about a candidate, hopefully, and to get involved in politics, because that's how we save our democracy. Not just us here collectively, but the youth who don't vote and who don't participate. We have to give them hope. So it's a long answer, but there's a lot there that I hope to gives you an idea of how I'm going to approach this. Okay, the gentleman. I never get applause. So I want to do a couple of additional questions. Who have I offended the most by not calling on you? Okay, so I've got these two fellows over here. Okay. And here. And you. So 1, 2, 3, right? Okay, gentleman this one.
Bob Children. It's very encouraging hearing there's something I'm very confused about, and that is our level of defense spending. I think it's about half of our gross tax receipts. 24%? It's a big number. Yeah. And compared to all the other countries in the world, I think we spend more than all of them together.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
So it seems like, to me, first of all, I don't understand why we spend that kind of money. And if we could cut that in half, it seems like a lot of our problems would be fixed. Maybe we'd have health care, maybe we'd fix our roads, maybe our social security would be secure. You know, a lot of these problems seem like they just evaporate if we can dump so much money into that central. So first of all, I don't understand why we do it. And it seems like a good avenue forward would be reducing that. It makes sense.
Yeah, I think we're absolutely in agreement on this. I think that people don't, so first of all, you provided some statistics and they sound right. So I think a lot of people don't know how much is spent. And I think the way we talk about defense spending is that we have to do this for the troops. So I think we have to figure out if the troops actually do benefit from what we're spending money on. So I know it doesn't sound sexy, but I think increased transparency on where the money goes is incredibly important to collectively informing ourselves about those funding sources. But I also think we have to be careful. I think we have to be careful that we don't just take a chainsaw to a budget without being thoughtful. And so it's something that I definitely will look into. It's something I certainly would champion, particularly if it's something that would solve both our fiscal problems and also help save some of the programs that we also desperately need. Okay, so I'm going to go to this fellow next, even though I sat back here because my peripheral vision's bad. So.
No.
Oh,
all right.
You're trading your question.
Well, no. Okay, so how do you anticipate? How difficult do you anticipate it's going to be to manage accountability to the party and your constituency at the same time? Because that's a tough one.
It's incredibly difficult. And Brian Baird, who had this seat 8 years ago, because he took sort of a pragmatic approach to governing, frequently wasn't given those plum committee seats because he was a little bit of a maverick in some areas. So I'm aware of that tension. I know it's going to happen regardless of who controls the House. But I'm always going to put the needs of Southwest Washington before the needs of my party. It's why my motto is people over politics. It's why I'm running. So if leadership asks me to do something that I don't believe will benefit my district, I'm not going to do it. That's a really easy answer for me. I will also hold myself to account when I do something and people still think I've made the wrong decision by coming back and telling you why I've done it. Okay, so there was one fellow in the back, and then I'll come to you next. So you were, I've seen you before, so you've been in my other town hall, or labor. Okay, go ahead, sorry.
Jim Opperman from Aberdeen.
Okay.
Follow up on this question about the Pentagon.
Yeah.
And military spending. About 25 or 30 years ago, the Pentagon decided, it might have been even 40 years ago, we will amp up our military to fight 2 major wars at one time.
Yeah.
So that's why that insane thought process is spending so much money on the military. We are supposed to be capable of fighting 2 major wars. That's insane.
Yes, it is.
My question is, how are you going to deal with the corporations that are stranglehold on Washington, D.C.?
Well, I think part of it is campaign finance reform, which we've talked about a couple times, and also increasing transparency and where the money comes from, a lot of it coming from corporations. And the other thing is public shaming. I think we have to really focus on what corporations are doing in terms of where their money goes. We have to focus on what lobbyists are doing. And I think that a lot of things are happening behind the scenes that we're not aware of. And so it really is sunshine being the best disinfectant. And so I'd like to do that in part. And it's Jim, and we met in Longview, right? Okay, I just want to make sure I got it right. So we can talk a little bit more. I want to, you get the final question. Yeah, because I want people then to share their thoughts. The pressure is on you.
So I'm Sherry, I'm a teacher, and I took 2 classes from you several years ago.
How did you do?
I did very well.
Okay, Sherry gets the last question.
I'm a government teacher.
Okay.
I go to bed every night, and I worry about my DACA kids. But I'm worried about their parents, too. Yeah. And we hear this phrase, immigration reform, and I don't even know what it means. And I'm curious, can you tell me what you think it means?
What immigration reform?
Yeah. Or at least, how do you even begin to tackle?
There's just so many pieces of it. So I've said a little bit about DACA. I pivoted with the question that was asked earlier. We got to fix that. We got to fix it immediately. We also have to deal with the issue of deportations. And so I actually want to approach this a little bit differently, Cheryl, which is that we have had an tick in deportations that is really hurting families. So let me talk a little bit about Pacific County. So there was a fabulous story in the Seattle Times a couple of weeks ago about what's happening in Pacific County, which is that people are disappearing. Because now what President Trump has done is rather than deporting violent criminals, which is what happened under the Obama administration, you could be deported for anything. So people are being followed home. People are getting taken away without anybody knowing what's going on because there's a lack of communication between ICE and also the local law enforcement. And it's devastating industries. So in Pacific County, when I met with the oyster canneries at Goose Point Cannery, I said, what's the biggest problem facing you? And one of their problems is ghost shrimp, and I actually know so much about this that I'd love to talk to you about it sometime. And they said the second problem are the ICE raids. They are losing their employees. So it is hurting their business because they can't find people to take those jobs. And what happens when you deport someone? Their family is left behind. So people are losing their mothers, their fathers, their grandparents, and a lot of these people have been in the community for decades. And so that particular county is starting to rally in order to provide support for those individuals left behind, but that doesn't fix the underlying problem, which is that we don't know how to deal with deportations in a way that's humane when we've got a president whose position is to deport anybody regardless of how long they've been in the community. So that's the second part of immigration reform. The third part is, of course, the fence or the wall or whatever we want to call it. And unfortunately, all this stuff gets sort of bound together as this is immigration reform. And I think we ought to look at it in separate pieces. I think it's going to be really difficult to do so. But I share your heartbreak on an individual level for me at the university. It's students who are in tears because they're afraid they're going to be deported. And it's that incredible uncertainty. I lost students last semester because of this. And it breaks my heart as well. And the fact that we are taking a bludgeon to this conversation rather than coming from a point of humanity and love for those who are in our community is regrettable. And it is, to use my word, a travesty. So I think part of it is us coming together and really providing the support on a community level for individuals, and then also trying to really press for true reform that gets rid of what might be a problem, but also provides a pathway to citizenship. So I'm going to use the last 10 minutes to open it up, to have you just share with me some of your comments that you have, because this is supposed to be more about listening, and I always do so much talking. So we'll just make this a free-for-all. You can talk to me. Then people wanted to say, oh, you guys are clever, aren't you? Okay, go ahead.
One quick comment.
Yeah.
I'm a meat-eating, Second Amendment-supporting liberal Democrat who favors testing, licensing, and liability insurance for those who wish to engage in firearms for sporting or pleasure. Would you support such a thing? Training, testing, licensing, and insurance.
So I'm lost on. So yes, for the other ones, I'm lost on the insurance part. You're talking about
Just
being able
the
to
same way you carry liability insurance on a car.
have insurance for having a gun.
Yep.
I had never thought about that. I think that's interesting. I think that's very interesting.
No,
He's
the idea,
right.
I was a National Guardsman in the 1960s, and one of the fellows in the 186th, living in an apartment, was cleaning a weapon that he believed to be unloaded, and the bullet went through the wall of his apartment into the apartment next door. That's what impressed me at the time, wondering, my God, if he had hurt someone, it would have destroyed 2 families. How about just the same thing? If you hurt someone with your car, you got to have liability insurance.
It's an interesting policy statement. So yeah, let me think about it. I like innovative ways of skinning cats too. So I'll give you credit for that one, sir.
I read in our paper that you originally, just a few years ago, were an Oregon resident, and now you, as I understand it, are a Washington resident, and it is going to be used, is being used against you, that you just moved over here to run for state office. So how are you going to help that?
Yeah, you're kind. I think the phrase is elite carpetbagger sent by Oregonians So in the paper I said, so I'm some Manchurian candidate, and then I said, but it wasn't reported, that this is the Frank Sinatra version, not the Lee Shriver version. But it's a serious question, so let me address it. And let me tell you that I actually moved in July. So it's actually more recent than you realize. It's something that had been in the works for a while. My husband's been trying to move up here for a job change. So it's not something that I did just to run for office. But let me tell you how I answered it. I answered it by saying, I taught this woman 20 years ago. I'm teaching that woman right there. I taught Cheryl, I don't know how long ago, she was pretty young. I've been in this community for 22 years working at Washington State University. I know more about Southwest Washington than Salem, Oregon, which is where my husband is living. I know so much more about Southwest Washington that I can say with confidence that I think I am the best candidate with the best understanding of Southwest Washington because I've been in the community for 22 years. That's my answer. I would also add that the reason why that story hit and why people put up my voter registration and all of that is because they're scared. Because they know I'm going to win this race, and I'm going to put up a big fight, and I'm going to take back this house for Washington 3rd. Is it scrappy enough for you?
One of the most difficult issues that you're going to have to face in the context of immigration reform, etc., is that there is a substantial racial divide in this country. And essentially, it's pitting white nationalists against the dreamer population, if you will, using that in the broadest sense. I really believe in the United States and the United States Constitution. I believe ours is a nation of ideas, not genetics. And the question is, how do you move that idea forward in an atmosphere of white nationalism?
It's a great question. Let me tell you how I moved that forward at a local level that I'd like to see duplicated and taking steps to see that it's duplicated. I mentioned the Initiative for Public Deliberation. I want to go back to that because one of the issues that we tackled was race. And when I started telling people that I was going to use IPD to facilitate conversations about race, they were like, oh my word. And I was like, that's exactly why we're doing it. Because I don't think we know how to talk about race in America. We don't talk about it. And it's not only that we don't know how to, we don't talk about race in America. So I think we need to learn to have these conversations in a candid way.
Don't talk about it.
Some communities don't. That's true, that's true. So I would say that through IPD, at least our communities are talking about it because we've brought those forums to communities. And what I've done this year, before entering this race, is I put into place a conference that we're holding in February where we are inviting high school students and college students from throughout the state of Washington, as well as community members, to be trained in our techniques so they can then go back to their communities and have their own initiatives for public deliberations. So I'm colonizing. I'm trying to take my idea and spread it as far as possible. Because I think if we learn to have these conversations and we are satisfied with the conversations, which you will be, then you will learn that we can have these conversations and it won't be, as you said, the white nationalists, etc. Because what we do in those conversations is we find where we have common values and we find where we have common beliefs. And it really is incredibly productive. And a final pitch for IPD is that we are going to have community conversations about the opioid crisis coming to your community soon. But I think you're absolutely right. It's a challenge. But let's do what we can, at least on a small basis, to have those conversations. I'm running tight on time, so Kirsten.
I just want to add a little bit to your comment. I am a first-generation immigrant, and I am of a kind of the Norwegian side of the
Oh, we like you.
You gave up no part of this.
But I think the issue of race, I have been fortunate enough to have surrounded myself with people who have really educated me well about there is no such thing as race, even though our culture, the United States culture, has divided people based on race and discriminated against race. I think our education needs to change regarding white privilege and the real history, our real history of the United States that creates mass incarceration today, how culturally and institutionally racism is alive and well. And it was not until my eyes were opened to my privilege, even though I'm a first-generation immigrant, the fact that I'm white, how privileged I am. I'm not targeted when I'm taking MAX or the bus. I know people of color who are just targeted because of the color of their skin. So all of us, most of us are white in this room, and I hope you take the time to learn what white privilege means.
I absolutely agree. And we talked about this in my class in preparations for our conversations. So I will let you have the last comment, and then I have a closing remark because we're running out of time.